this country is a particularly interesting one to look at in terms of what's happening. What are those parameters that are affecting illicit trade? And the first thing is the levels of inflation that you've been grappling with. I mean, it's down to 25% right now, which is still amongst the highest rate of inflation in the entire world. And I know that a year ago it was in the 30s and even higher. But the problem with inflation is, the reason that this is particularly important when it comes to illicit trade is that this erodes consumers' purchasing power and their ability to afford products. And when you are in your household, your family are seeing your rupee not going as far to buy whatever products you need, whether it's a pack of cigarettes or whether it's a tube of toothpaste or laundry detergent, when that doesn't go as far, the consumer turns toward cheaper alternatives. And that's where the illicit traders take advantage of everyday shoppers. So the inflation is a particularly challenge to this country that already has a significant level of illicit trade. And that's point two, which is the shadow economy that exists here already. The informal economy can be quantified by as much as 40%. 4 out of 10 products, 4 out of 10 rupees sold go into the shadow economy. And I've got a slide coming up, but we're talking about fast-moving consumer goods, household goods, tobacco, alcohol, agricultural products, food products, from tea to sugar to cooking oil, petroleum. I mean, major parts of the economy are subject to unfair competition from illicit trade. Your country has this problem. You're not the only one, but it's something that needs to be addressed. Another factor that we found in putting the report together was the association between illicit trade and other negative externalities, if you will, or other crimes that your government is trying to stop. And those are money laundering. The profits from illegal trade and illicit trade goes right into money laundering that fuels other sorts of activities, including terrorism. Organized crime is behind all of this. Corruption is the problem that facilitates it, whether it's in the private sector, whether it's intermediaries like maritime shipping companies or online platforms or government officials. And then there's the issue of tax evasion. So one of the things I want to talk about is a report that we published a couple years ago. It's actually called the Global Illicit Trade Environment Index. On that index, what we did is we took a look at 84 countries worldwide. It's not the entire world, but we only had so much budget. But we had analyzed 84 countries. And we took a look at, what is their ability? What is their structural capability to defend their economy from illicit trade? So we looked at things like government policy. We looked at supply and demand. We looked at, how transparent were the markets? What are some of the trading trends? And what's the customs environment look like? And we created, I think, 20 different indicators upon which we based the score. We collected the data, we interviewed people, we put the scores together, and we published the index. And when the day was done and the numbers were calculated, unfortunately, Pakistan came in at number 72 out of 84, which is not a good score. I've had a lot of different types of reactions to this report. I think the best reaction we got was from a country in the Caribbean called Trinidad and Tobago. I don't know if any of you have ever been there for a holiday, and if you haven't, I recommend that you go there. It's a beautiful place. But the Minister of Trade and Economy read our report, and she was outraged. And she set about creating an entire set of laws, a task force, a public-private partnership to fight illicit trade. And she went to the media and she spoke about, announced all of these new initiatives that she was taking, and she attributed to the fact that her country was ranked 79 out of 84. So it's a way to drive change, because it's not just pointing the finger at what has not been done, but it's a roadmap to what improvements can be made. So I think one of the main reasons that there was such a low score, and you can find a lot more information about this in the report. I'm not going to go into all the details, but one of the main problems, as you can imagine, is customs. So the ranking on customs here in Pakistan was particularly low. A lot of that had to do with shortage of manpower and resources, insufficient ability to control your borders. You have borders with China, borders with Afghanistan. There's perfect opportunity for a lot of smuggling to take place. And, other things too, like you need technologies, monitoring and surveilling technologies for the border. It can't just be, human bodies patrolling back and forth. So I think, this was contributed significantly to the low score, but I think from what I can see from the audience reaction is, this is the type of thing that can be fixed. This is the type of thing where more resources, more people, higher priority, better training of customs can immediately cut down on what comes across the border. Some other areas that received low scores were intellectual property protection. I'm hoping to meet with the IPO tomorrow. I do understand that they've made some great progress, changed some laws over the last couple of years, made it a little bit easier for companies to report trademark infringements or to try to stop counterfeiting, but I can tell you that there's an enormous amount of work that still needs to be done in that space, so I'm hoping to be able to speak with them about that. So if you go, I want you to also, if you get a chance to go onto the website, there's only so much I can do tonight. There's an enormous amount of information there's your country report. There are also a lot of country reports on neighboring countries. India, for example. We did one on Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, and all the other stands. And so there are country reports that are out there. There's this index that's out there. There's studies that we've done on link to forced labor. And then there's this report that I'm going to talk about for just a minute. I mentioned it in my opening remarks. And this is a study that we did where we compared countries on their ability to fight illicit trade and their ranking in terms of their credit ratings from S&P, Fitch's, Moody's. These credit ratings may or may not be part of your daily life. They're certainly not part of most people's daily life, but they significantly impact the ability of this country to borrow funds on the open market and to attract investment into this economy. And what our study showed is there is a direct correlation, a direct negative correlation between a country's ability to fight illicit trade and its score. And I think, what I'm getting at is that countries with high scores on their capacity to fight illicit trade have better credit ratings. TRACIT, for the first time ever, published this report where we documented cases of child and forced labor associated with the illicit supply chains. This report was picked up by the International Labor Organization. We shared it with the United States government, with the UK, in the EU, in Brussels, trying to raise awareness because so many governments are trying to step up their protection of human rights. You've all heard about this. Governments are signing international treaties. We're realizing the value of human beings and trying to stop these horrible abuses of child labor and forced labor around the world. Well, what TRACIT is saying, just our little piece of the game, is to remind governments that illicit trade creates demand for forced labor. And if you're going to achieve your human rights objectives, you need to take a look at illicit trade. It's my message to labor ministers. And it's the same message I said earlier that we're trying to make to finance ministers, right? It's not just about customs and law enforcement. This is about finance issues. This is about human rights and labor issues. All the ministers of all the governments need to be thinking how illicit trade is eroding and undermining, their objectives in other space. So take a look at this report. It's quite interesting. And I think we're getting kind of near the end. What I wanted to do was, I didn't want to just come and point out all the problems, but maybe suggest, some recommendations. Certainly, there's a lot to do. It's not just recommendations I make in Pakistan, but recommendations we make elsewhere. And like I said, Ali has set up some meetings, and we'll have an opportunity to share these recommendations with government, so I'm not going to go into it too deeply. But one thing is we do need to improve enforcement. And there are a lot of tools that can be worked with. Implementing training programs, for example, are hugely important. I said I was in Panama not too long ago. 3 weeks ago I was in Panama. And one of the things, it was a meeting of heads of customs. And they were pointing out, you can have the money, you can have the technology, but it comes down to the person that's working there. And that person has to be trained. They have to be knowledgeable. They have to know what they're doing. We can't just ask them to be able to identify a fake. We need to train them. And so this is what I'm getting at. I think, there's amending the Smuggling Act. There's a lot about that in the news. I think in expanding the definition of smuggling, creating greater deterrent penalties can be introduced, make that law more stronger and perhaps more effective. I think there's a lot of discussion on track and trace solutions on illicit trade, not just on tobacco, but other sectors, including, I forget, tires, I think. Sugar and cement, exactly. These are great technologies that can improve, the overall collection of the taxes. But we have this. You have this system in place. You have a good system in place. It hasn't been fully implemented. Why not? And it needs to, make sure that it's, fully encompassing. You can't just have one or two companies in one of the sectors that are abiding by the new system. It has to be across the industry for it to be effective. So these are some of the recommendations that we're making on enforcement. Governance and priorities. I mentioned earlier, your prime minister is rare among prime ministers talking about these issues like money laundering, smuggling, and illicit trade. It's rare that these issues can get to that level. So you have that going for you. I think you need to build momentum there. The second recommendation that I have here, appoint an interagency coordinator. This is a perfect opportunity for the Prime Minister to say, this is a priority for me. I've been saying to you pretty much all evening that it can't just be customs or police. It has to be, all of the ministries have to be involved. So one of the things the Prime Minister can do, if he's serious about this, is to appoint someone with power, in authority, who can has oversight over these different agencies and put a strategic plan in place. Not unlike the one I suggested from Trinidad and Tobago. It might be a small country, but it's a country with a big voice. And there's no reason that you can't do the same. The United States is certainly one of the leaders in this area, and they have an anti-illicit trade coordinator in this space. Let's go to the next slide. A couple more comments on governance. I think I've kind of talked about taxes enough, but there needs to be the right balance of taxes. Taxes have to take into consideration other things, right? Overall consumption, the price, the income level of the people that are being taxed, their ability to afford products. So in our view, especially when excise taxes are introduced, it's not don't introduce them, but make sure you do a study. Do an analysis of what the impacts might be as taxes are introduced, and what are the impacts as they're increased. Because we all know governments like to increase taxes. Just a couple more recommendations. Again, I keep going back to IP rights. A lot of the member companies of TRACIT are companies that sell products to consumers. They have trademarks protecting these products from unfair competition. It's something that next slide please. Yeah, that one. It's something that we really try to emphasize. It can be done. There are countries in this world that have supreme intellectual property right protections. Let's take France for an example. And I think that's because they're extremely proud of the products. Italy, for example, they're proud of the products that they make. They don't want, they don't want these products fake. They don't want the income, the national income from their exports eroded from unfair competition, from a fake from China. So we want to emphasize that, and that's why I'm asking for a meeting with them. And the last slide then is really just what I think has a lot to do with the deterrence. And one of the main things we try to do at TRACIT is raise awareness, okay? I'm talking to you about the policy recommendations, but that whole story starts with awareness. So hopefully there were some things that I said today that raise your awareness. Maybe you can go back to the organization you work for or the government agency that you work for with greater awareness, and that you can go into someone's office and say, hey, you know, I heard this, this is what's happening, this is what we need to do. So it starts with awareness, but then it comes down to the hard work of strengthening legislation, because a lot of legislation is in place. Let's take IP. A lot of that legislation is in place. We need to enforce it. You know, a lot of that legislation is in place. We need to make sure that the penalties, the deterrent penalties for the criminals, are actually exercised and that they're penalized. So, really, these are some of the recommendations. Some of them are big picture. Some of them are very specific to legislations and laws that exist here. And I think, you know, by partnering with Prime, you know, our objective was to be able to have a local partner with a local voice, a respected partner who understands policymaking, who understands the interaction between government and the private sector, where we can share these recommendations and we can work together, you know, and try to make some progress here. So it's just one step along the path, and I'm really honored to have that opportunity to come here and to tell that story to you. And I encourage you to have a look at the report, and I thank you with all my heart for your time.